It's a great privilege to be with you today at the Stronger Conference 2020. Been very excited about joining you. It's a great privilege to be asked, and you've got a great team behind this. And really, I'm excited about sharing with you for this webinar or this session that's focusing really on communicating for change, but really it's connecting for change. All of us communicate, but so few of us connect. And in a moment, I'll share a little bit about my journey and my story, but I feel like the greatest pain point, whether you're a communicator in a church, a preacher, a teacher, teaching in a classroom, teaching in any setting or leading in any setting, the biggest issue with communication is we erroneously assume that people have heard what we've said. And I would love to just debunk some of the issues, some of the problems, some of the roadblocks today that can inhibit us and restrict us from communicating effectively so people actually hear what we want them to say. Rob, why is that important? Well, let me run a very quick exercise by you. I say the word anchor in a room of 100 people. To one person, when they hear the word anchor, they think of the wonderful holidays they had in Cornwall with the family by the sea on the boat. And when the anchor went down, it just fills their minds with such wonderful memories. However, someone just sitting 2 rows in front or behind, they get the word anchor and they remember the story and the incident of their friend drowning on a river. Same word, but different interpretation and different impact by one simple word. And so communication is incredibly important. And I am passionate about communication. I'm a John Maxwell certified coach and speaker. I spend my life communicating either in written form, speaking, coaching, but I've always struggled with communication and particularly connecting when communicating. So let's rewind all the way back to when I was 7 years old. I get up to do a presentation for my school, and I get up and it's a Moses moment. I start to stutter. My words don't come out effectively or efficiently. And before I know it, I'm being laughed off from the little platform where I was getting up to communicate simply because I was scared and it didn't come naturally to me. Fast forward to age 24, and I've just been through a process to become a Church of England curate. And at the BAP, the Bishop's Advisory Panel, I do this presentation and they give me a report at the end saying, "Congratulations, Rob, you've been recommended for training." And they said the one area that I needed to work on was my ability to present and communicate and pitch content appropriately. There's a thread, there's a pattern being woven throughout the fabric of my communication journey. Not only that, when I was finally accepted to be a curate, I get up, I share who I am, and then we have to run an exercise whereby we're marked on a scale of 1 to 40 in a different area as it pertains to our leadership and our communication. And I get the lowest result, the lowest number out of every single curate in the Diocese of London. So on paper, I shouldn't be doing a webinar or a session on communication. And I say that because it means I can share with you on a journey that I've been on about how difficult communication can be. But I realized that I'm not born a natural communicator, but I can develop the skills that I've been given. And so today, what I'd love to do is just share what I believe are the 5 key tenets, principles, handles that we can use in any message. I'm going to talk about the context of communicating in church, but generally these 5 things you can use. And over the past year, I've had the privilege of interviewing over 100 global leaders around communication and around leadership. And I'm going to bring out some of those principles that I've learned. It's going to be as if you and I are sitting down with a mug of coffee with some of the greatest leaders and speakers that have been blessed, anointed, and gifted by God. And hopefully I'll give you a window into some of the key things that we need to improve our communication and connect with people. and they can hear what we're saying, not us just assuming that they've heard what we've said. And so all that to say, I would say the first thing we need to do if we're to connect with people, to get out of the pile, to get in the top 5% of speakers that actually communicate what they want to say, but also that their listeners hear what you've said, the first thing we need to do is do the hard work of healthy self-awareness and analysis. It begins with you. You cannot communicate to a level any higher than you are internally. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, Rob. What do you mean? I've become a better communicator the more work I've placed on my internal state and my character than my external gifting and competency. Because if you think about it, to connect with an audience, you first have to create common ground. You've got to create common ground before you can take your listener to higher ground. And everyone listening is thinking, why should I listen to you? Amidst all the competing data that's vying for my attention on a daily basis, why on earth should I listen to you? Now, of course, in the church setting, we have the wonderful advantage in many ways of coming to our presentation or coming to our 30-minute talk with the belief, the awareness, and the authority of Scripture speaking through us. Remember, if you're in a church setting, you're just the vessel. It is God's voice. But let me tell you what this isn't. I'm not sharing about preaching in particular. I am talking about communication. So the first thing we need is to do the hard work of pruning out some areas of our lives that will enable us to not feel restricted or inhibited when we're communicating, but being able to communicate out of the overflow of who we are. So I spent many years resisting the opportunity to share exactly what had gone on in my life, the strengths, the weaknesses. I ignored Oswald Chambers' quote, "Your greatest strength is also a double weakness." And so I never lived within that paradox of being able to share out of your scars. Remember, not out of your scabs, because if you share out of your scabs, horrible image, but it's not fully healed. So I'm not saying communicate out of your pain or out of your current brokenness, but when you've been healed, when you've done that internal work, it will make you a better communicator. You know, it's the pruning process that none of us want to participate in that produces the results everybody wants to receive. So if communication, if you like, is a bit like a dance. You're taking the lead. They're following you. When you pause, they reflect. When you raise your voice, or if you use intonation, or if you slow down, or if you speed up, you're literally the gauge by which people are flowing. And it's about tempo and pace. But before you get into all the techniques, we've got to look at ourselves, because I can't focus on being a blessing to you and impacting you if I'm trying to be impressive. My mentor, John Maxwell, who's a brilliant communicator, said it takes 7 years for a communicator to find his or her voice. And the reason it takes 7 years is simply they have not yet wrestled with the fact that they don't quite accept who they've been called to be. They don't acknowledge they've been wired for a particular work. They've been crafted for a calling. They've been built by design. They want to borrow someone else's voice. And you can imitate someone for so long, but at some point that imitation has to shift to inspiration, and you have to develop and cultivate your voice. And you cultivate your voice when you do the hard work of dealing with who you are internally. So the first thing is about internal work, but then we need to be really intentional about connecting and finding common ground, as I've said, because I think so often we try and, let's go with the church setting, we just read the Bible because what we've been taught, we've been erroneously taught that just read the Bible, and at least if you've read the Bible, there's nothing else to do. I'd like to challenge that thought. You need to build a bridge and walk over to where people are, as opposed to just read the Bible and assume they're going to walk over to where you are. I'm a coach, a speaking coach, and last year we trained leaders and speakers from over 20 different nations, from Fiji to Australia, New Zealand, America, England, Finland, and it doesn't matter where they've come from, whatever age, whatever stage, whatever place, whatever space, it really doesn't matter. The one thing that's common, woven throughout the fabric of all of it, is people have this propensity to believe people are just going to receive what they have to say. And actually, for me to connect with people, it starts one-to-one before it starts with a crowd. So I would say something really practical for any communicator: become a master at communicating effectively and efficiently one-to-one. So I work really hard on this every day. Any opportunity I have to just send audio messages to people and to practice speaking and to create common ground. It could be through humor. It could just be delving into how they're doing. Whatever means or mode I try to connect, every day I try to get better at connecting one-to-one. Because when I'm in a crowd, all you've got to think about is the crowd is just made up of lots of ones. We think we have to act differently. And yes, you've got to project differently and you've got to carry yourself slightly differently. But ultimately, to connect for change, you've got to find common ground. And if you study the best teachers and preachers, they're masters at framing up what they're about to say before sharing the truth. Because please write this down. Before trust can be received, before truth can be received, trust must be established. But before truth can be received, trust must be established. And the best way to establish trust is by using those first 3 to 5 minutes you have by creating common ground. Now, I do this all the time when I speak. I naturally look young, and I used to get really paranoid and upset about looking young because often people will make a judgment call on their perception of you rather than the revelation about you, and it can be frustrating. So I decided to flip what I saw as a weakness to be a great strength. So I would tell a story about how a woman walked up to me after I preached. I'd come off the platform. She walked down the aisle. She smiled at me. She put her arm on my wrist and she said, "What a wonderful opportunity that a teenager would have the opportunity to communicate the gospel and do it quite effectively." And instantly it addresses the elephant in the room. This guy looks young, but also I can add humor before hitting home the truth and the authority I'm coming with to share this presentation. There's a reason Nurofen is coated with sugar, because if we didn't have the sugar over the top of the substance within the tablet, we wouldn't be able to handle the horrible taste of that medicine. So it's coated with sugar. And so I think humor does go a long way. It is to be our servant, not our master. But humor goes an awful long way in helping establish a connection with our audience. And, the opposite of connection is self-protection. So if you're not willing to go to where people are, then there's no way they're going to establish trust with you and go to where you are. And it's about finding similarities in those opening few moments, not differences. So whenever I'm preparing a message, I imagine I've got 3 people around a table with me. I've got the single mother who's struggling to make ends meet. I've got the teenager wrestling through school, maybe being bullied, trying to find out who they are, what they're doing. I've got the 45-year-old CEO, and yes, I'm making stereotypes, but just it's serving the point I'm trying to make. I'm looking at as many different ways I can communicate with someone as possible. And that's the complete opposite to what I was brought up with. Share the text, say the 3 point that you've got, normally alliterated, give the application, and just trust that the Holy Spirit has worked through what you've said, and that's fine. I think we do have to work like it depends on us and pray like it depends on God. God will override the poorest communication. That's a fact, that's biblical. But I think my biggest struggle, whether it's leading people one-to-one or communicating with people in a crowd, is they haven't heard what I've said. And that's not their fault. Even if they're not listening attentively, hearing is a necessity, but listening is a privilege. And so I have to do the hard work, the really hard work of making sure people hear what I say. So we want to do the groundwork of internally making sure we're whole and we can share out of our pain and our experiences, but we also want to be intentional and connect with the people and discover our voice. Now, let me just give you the 5 things I think are essential for a great message, and they all begin with the same letter. But Stephen Furtick, a speaker in America, taught me this at a masterclass. It's not widely known. I've elaborated on it and developed it a little bit, but these 5 factors I think should be in any message, and I'll give you them gradually. I won't give them all immediately. I'll just go through them one by one. But the first thing every message needs to have, once you've done the work of finding your voice, discovering who you are, once you've realized it's about being impactful, not impressive, once you've realized that you're ready to prepare, you've prayed, you've prepared adequately, then you do your kind of checklist of whether your message has these 5 things. The first thing is every great message has focus. That means I want every message I speak to have one sentence, a 1-sentence premise. Just if you can't share your message in a sentence, you're not ready to give that sermon or that presentation. If I was to ask you now, if you're speaking this Sunday, what's your 1-line premise? The majority of people would give me a sermon outline. And the reason a 1-line premise is so difficult is you've really got to dig for that 1-line premise. It's never on the surface level. So, for example, if you're going to preach the prodigal son, you'll probably pull out 3 points from that passage and just share what's on the surface level, and you create your 1-line premise based on that. However, it takes a lot more work to actually not just study the text, but to stare at it. We're not imposing ourselves on the text, but what we are doing is we're getting in the scene. We're imagining, because you can preach the prodigal son from the father's perspective, the brother's perspective. You could preach it from the pig's perspective. You could preach it from any perspective. And your freshness is in the approach and the angle you take. You're not reshaping the scripture, but you are coming at it with a fresh lens. And so the first thing you need to establish is, what is my 1-line premise? And that's usually the last thing in my message prep. So it's knowing where I'm going, so that whatever approach I take to getting there, at least I know where it's ending. So there's a reason every film, every director, every Netflix show, they shoot the final scene first. They always start with the end in mind. So let's establish whether you're a linear preacher, which is point 1, point 2, point 3, conclusion, or if you're a circular preacher. I'm a circular speaker, so it's as if you're leading your listener into a forest. They don't know why you've taken them down that road, why you've told that story, but you know where you're going, and eventually you're going to lead them out of the maze to where you want them to go. That's a very different approach. But once you've established whether you're linear, point 1, 2, 3, circular, or a conceptual speaker, like you're going to pick a concept and use that. Once you've established those things, then you need to start to think, okay, how am I going to land the plane? Like, I need to choose a runway. Where's this going to land? And so knowing where you're going, I think, is the hardest part of preparation, because there are 30 different things in a text that I really love, but I have to find out where this is going, this 1-sentence premise. OSP, 1-sentence premise. What's the distinction? A good premise, a good 1-line sentence has a distinction. So, in Shawshank Redemption, I love the film. Andy Dufresne's crawling through a sewer. Morgan Freeman said he crawled through however many yards of foul-smelling substance just to come out on the other side. And that's what communication and preaching is often like in those early moments while you try and get your focus. It's like crawling through the commentaries, crawling through your own cognitive biases and finding that aha moment. Because I think communicators are great at the discovery phase or the delivery phase. Rarely are they great at both. So it's like you've got 2 sides of the mountain when you're communicating. You're going up this mountain to get your revelation from God. It's an insight, it's a word for the people, and you get up to the mountain and you get that revelation. But now you need to figure out, how do I get back down? It's like Moses, I've received the 10 tablets, the 10 commandments from God. I've received them. Now I need to go down and try and communicate it to people that are dancing naked around a golden calf. Like, one thing to discover, it's another thing to deliver. Those that are great at delivery sometimes water down the substance of the message, the content. And so we just need to make sure that we do the hard work of going up the mountain and like discovering something in the text that makes you passionate, that gets you excited, that's going to bless and add value to the people. So let's use the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10 as an example. Everyone always creates an outline of going through the 3 people that wandered across the path, and we land on the Good Samaritan, and then we connect it to Jesus, and then we say the real fact of the story is, who is your neighbor? Is it the fact that it was a Samaritan and a Jew? Is that really what we're talking about? Reconciliation, which is great, a great outline. But to dig deeper, like to not just share what's on the surface level, to get a new insight, to get your one-line premise, you need to get into the story and find a pattern. So I would think, okay, what are the connecting points? What's the connective tissue in this story? It's footprints. So the man starts off on the journey, footprints, and he gets mugged, and he's on the ground and he hears different footprints, 3 different types of people: those that stop, those that walk on, those that are too worried about themselves getting mugged in the process, because if they'd have stopped on that busy road, then it's a good chance someone else would have mugged them. And so there's a theme, there's a thread. And when you've got that focus, so for me, if I was to preach on the Good Samaritan on footprints, now I can ignore everything else in the text. This is what I'm going to be talking on. I've got my focus, footprints. And oftentimes we have a sermon title, but really that one sentence we have, it's the outline and not the distinction. So what's your distinction? I did a talk last week, and the distinction, the one-line premise was God will use us as broken vessels to broadcast his voice. Okay, so now I've got my sentence. There are loads of other good things in my periphery, but that's not going to serve the purpose of this message. So I'm going to make sure I have my one-line sentence. And please hear, when I say premise, I don't mean subject. So some people would say, oh, my one-line premise is freedom, faith, and friendship. That's an outline, not a premise. If you're talking about freedom, faith, and friendship, you could shift it and talk about, and I know we're getting really into the sewage of this, but it's really important when you get your focus before we move on to the other things. Rather than freedom, faith, and friendship, which is a subject, you could talk about having the faith to seek freedom in friendships. There's a distinction. So I'm talking about faith and freedom in friendships. So that's the first thing. You need focus, and it starts with focus. Once you've got focus, then you can have flow. Focus, then flow. You want your listeners to not say, where did he get that? But why didn't I see that? The greatest communicators don't tell you what is in the text that you could read for yourself. They give you the gift of making it as though you've discovered it for yourself. So, for example, rather than saying, and in verse 22, Matthew tells us that Jesus walked on water. I know it's not Matthew 22, but rather, you're getting the point. Rather than say, and Jesus walked on water, Matthew tells us in verse 13, why don't you take them on a journey? I was really wrestling in my study time because I always thought that the other disciples were lacking faith by not getting out of the boat. But then I realized as I read the text, as Jesus was ushering Peter towards him, the issue wasn't that the disciples were unfaithful by staying in the boat. They were being obedient because they'd never been called. And then I hit a principle: there's nothing worse than stepping out on a word that Jesus never spoke. What's more powerful? Telling the story and revealing a principle so the person thinks they've received that insight themselves, or just saying, and my second point, verse 27, Jesus said, come. Big difference, big distinction. And your flow will be determined by how you focus on your transitions. So every news broadcast, again, every Amazon Prime, every Disney Plus, every Netflix program, they're master at transitions. whether it's just a picture of the White House before shooting into the office. There are transitory moments. And in preaching, there are transitory statements, transitory phrases in a text that we often ignore. So don't ignore the therefores. Don't ignore the words and next. Don't ignore the words suddenly. We need flow, and transitions determine the flow. So let your listeners understand that you know where you're going and that you're taking them somewhere. It's a huge thing. Once you've got the focus, it needs the flow. So what's the structure of your message? You might write it out word for word. I can't do that. I have bullet points on a piece of paper and I know where I'm going. But determine what your flow's going to be. So traditionally, I'm sure the majority of people I'm speaking to, you'd start with reading the text, which is great, sharing why it's important. Maybe you'll share why your listener should listen to this today. And then you'd probably say point 1, point 2, point 3, application. Maybe give a picture of what it would look like if we apply these principles into our everyday lives. And then the message is done. Someone else will start with a story. Then they connect it to the one point they're trying to share, the focus. And then they wouldn't have any points. They'd walk you through the text like a journey. And then they'd end with application. What I'm saying is there's no set flow to a message, but just make sure you have one. Have a skeleton and make sure you put just as much effort into the skeleton as you do into the substance of what you're saying. So I think that's really important. And once you've got the flow, once you've got the focus, that leads you to the next F, which is a flip. What do you mean a flip, Rob? It doesn't necessarily have to be something new from scripture, but the flip is what Oprah Winfrey would say. Yes, I'm quoting Oprah on a communication class. It's what Oprah would say was an aha moment. It's the moment of revelation. It's the scripture speaking. It's the points you're trying to make. It doesn't always have to be something deep, but the flip is, give me a new way to think about this. Help me to, I know David kills Goliath every single time. Don't change the story, but give me a fresh angle on it. Like, show me that David's real battle wasn't necessarily Goliath. David's real battle was the few moments and few verses before when Saul tried to dress him in his own armor and his brothers ridiculed and mocked him. He had to overcome the battle of people pleasing and criticism and had to overcome the battle of discovering who he was and taking off the expectations of others. That was his first battle that enabled him to beat Goliath. That then enabled him to fight every other battle he would have from there on. So that's the flip, different moment. So let's be really practical here. You go through your sermon and then you get to the moment Goliath is knocked down, the 9-foot Philistine, the uncircumcised Philistine, down, wonderful. And people are expecting that's the end of your story, wonderful. But you say, but that's not the real battle. The real battle happened a few verses before. Rewind, come with me. Let's just sit in this. And so you've brought them on a journey and then you reveal the flip. Oh, the real battle happened when David had the courage to take off what other people were trying to put on. So that's the flip. And I'm always looking for a flip because otherwise it's not, if it's not fresh for me, it's not going to be fresh for you. Yes, I can get some really good ingredients out of the fridge and reheat a wonderful meal that I had 2 nights before, but it's not, no matter how good the ingredients and recipe is, it's not going to taste as good as if something's been freshly baked and come out the oven. And so I try to keep things fresh. It doesn't have to be new, but it does have to be fresh. So we've got focus. That's your 1-line sentence. You've got flow. That's the structure. That's the way it's going to get from where you are to where you want to go. Then we've got the flip, which is give me that fresh revelation. Give me something new. Give me something in a way I've never seen it before. Then we've got friction, or some people would call it tension. How do you get the tension? And why is tension important? Tension gets people's attention. You know, the amount of entrepreneurs I coach, and they all know sales 101 is the fact that people don't buy out of something that could improve their life necessarily. They buy to get them out of a pain point. So we've got to establish pain points. Why should they listen to you when they've got millions of YouTube videos being uploaded every minute? And so I'm really careful to make sure that within the first 2-3 minutes, I'll identify a pain point. What's the tension that I'm trying to address? And most communicators I listen to, they try to solve a problem rather than help you manage your tension. It's much better as a communicator to manage people's tensions rather than try to find a solution to their problem. Remember, I'm not talking about biblical preaching now. I'm talking about communication in general. We know that the solution to every problem is the gospel and Jesus. If you're a believer, if you're a person that's not of faith, I'm talking now about communication, that people like having problems solved. And so we need to make sure we're not really killing the diagnosis, this is what's wrong with you, without offering them the solution. But they won't even get to that point in your message unless you use those first few moments to establish some tension. Like, why should they listen to you above everything else going on? If you don't have tension, there may be nowhere to put your truth. You've not made a place for it in their hearts. A lot of them will be scrolling through their phone. A lot of them will be thinking about the meeting they have on Monday. A lot of people will be thinking about the pressure they're under, or the difficult relationships, or the way they've been perceived, or the way they've been ignored or not recognized. Like, you've got to hook them. And yes, the Bible speaks, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we give the Bible room to speak. Because let me give you an illustration. My daughter, she's 18 months. We have an 18-month-year-old baby girl, Gracie. We're expecting our second child this summer, which is exciting. But Gracie, it was her birthday, her 1-year birthday. And I thought what would be a great idea was to fill her toy sack. She has this big toy sack. Fill her toy sack with lots and lots of fresh new presents. And the evening before her birthday, I go to get her toy bag and to fill her bag with presents. And when I get the bag, I've discovered she's filled the toy bag with a whole load of recycling, rubbish from our recycling. And basically, as her father, I wanted to bless her and put new things in, brand new things into her toy bag. But there was nowhere to put it. She'd put lesser things into her toy sack because she's a year old at this point. She's put lesser things in, so I can't put greater things in myself. And I think sometimes that's the case with our communication and the truth that we have. We've got this great truth that God our Father's given us that he wants to bless his children with, but there's nowhere to put it because we haven't created tension, or we haven't started taking out the layers of distraction and maybe distortion of a text people have read growing up and they've just switched off before you've even started explaining or describing it. There are all these layers that need to be peeled back, all this rubbish that needs to be taken out so that people have their hearts ready to receive what we have to say. And so friction is really important. So you got your focus, you got your flow, you got your flip, you got your friction. And last but not least, the key to an amazing, powerful message that's received that you can use to connect with people is there needs to be flesh, which is you, incarnational. It needs to be vulnerable and transparent. So I've worked really hard in my life of just working tirelessly in my car, like my car time is my classroom time, just spending tireless hours and hours just honing and refining the stories and the incidents in my life that, and its appropriate level of vulnerability, that will connect with people. So I make sure there's flesh in the message. If I'm talking about waiting on God, trusting God, I will enter into the pain and the discomfort of sharing about my wife and I having multiple miscarriages and wondering whether God would ever give us children, and having to see everyone else get pregnant before us and battling with feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. And I realized entering into the discomfort of that vulnerability is what creates it's the vehicle for people to find deliverance and revelation in their own lives. But I've got to be willing to enter in so that they can receive something out from my message. So think in your life, where can you find flesh? Where can you find those moments to connect who you are into the story you're trying to share? Because I think every great message has friction. Because really what we're wanting from our listener is not just to give us information, but an impartation of where they've been, what they've received, and what's unique about your voice and what's unique about your story. Because I could go on YouTube and listen to a great professor unpack everything verse by verse, but give me something from your life that helps me in my life. And every great message, every great interview I've done, every great conversation I have, it's because people are willing to enter into vulnerability and transparency so that they can connect with their audience. So in a moment, we'll do some Q&A. And I've just been throwing some ideas on a blank canvas here. I've not tried to shape anything theologically. We haven't really even got into deep technical things. But I think to connect, what's really key is we use those 5 F's and we have adequate preparation. So I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this on my phone. I'm going to take a little risk, but there's no shortcut to suddenly. There's no such thing as an overnight success or overnight communicator. And so what you might see here is a number, 24,331. That's how many sermons, how many notes, how many messages that I've listened to in over a decade, whilst most evenings whilst people were out and about having fun, I was making sure I was listening to 6 talks a day, transcribing them word for word. So if you looked at that, I've got millions and millions of words from speakers and preachers from years and years, and that's because adequate preparation's needed before you prepare. I'll be honest, I'll just give you a window into what I think. I get upset when I see someone reading from notes every week, because I think we've got to internalize the message we've got. If an actor can memorize a script, if a soap character has new lines to prepare every week, and what they're sharing is important, but what we have is the words of eternal life, I think we should set aside time to prepare. I have the 90-91 principle in my life. I spend 90 days spending my first 90 minutes on my one most important task, which is becoming a better communicator. So after my quiet time, I make sure phone's off, everything is at a distance, and nothing goes in my calendar before my communication training. I did it this morning, 90 minutes. And you spend 90 days because it's seasonal. After 90 days, you shift your focus to another area of communication. But at the moment, I'm focusing on hand gestures. And you might say, oh, but this is all technique, Rob. What about becoming the person? Yeah, part of preparation is my next point, prayer. But make sure you adequately prepare. People like Joel Osteen, whether you love his theology or not, he spends 9 hours on a Saturday preparing. It's not just about the perks of presenting on a platform. It's about the price that can be paid before you present. So there's that. And then, of course, prayer. I think I'd recommend to anyone that doesn't have the book by E.M. Bounds on prayer. So I've got it just there. E.M. Bounds, Prayer. It's a brilliant book, and it'll get you fired up to prepare, but also to pray. And I think if we focus on these things, we'll really make space for our presentations to be strong, to be powerful, and I think that would be really, really helpful. So if you've got any questions, please do send them through. We've got about 15 minutes to just talk about anything that you've covered. But ultimately, the character of our praying will determine the character of our communicating. The character of our praying. And I really believe opportunities flow from the secret place. I really do believe that anything that's blessed or fruitful, it's a result of abiding in Jesus, abiding on the vine, making sure we're people that are committed to being as good as we can be at what we do. And so, yeah, any good books you recommend for preaching technique? Yeah, I think if you want a theological underpinning to communication, I'd use so I have a bookshelf specifically for preaching. I'm just going to lean over. I'd say the best book for actual theology of preaching is Tim Keller's book on preaching. I'd also say that John Stott's book, I Believe in Preaching, is fantastic. That's really helpful. With regards to techniques, I would look at anything by Carmen Gallo. He's literally interviewed and looked at thousands and thousands of communicators. So that's a really good book on storytelling. And then I would just listen to as many communicators as you can. I watch myself sometimes with the sound off to see if I look angry or see how I look, and I take time to really make sure that you're watching yourself, which is really painful to do. But communication, as I've said, is transportation, and you've got to make sure that the vessel which is communicating the message you've got is as efficient and as powerful as it can be. So I would suggest Keller's book and Carmen Gallo. Carmen Gallo has a great blog on communication, which is really, really good. I think that would be really helpful for people. And also have a diverse diet. So I actually read every week 4 publications that make me a better preacher. I read, and there's no political weight, or this isn't a loaded statement, but I read 4 publications. I will read the Financial Times because I want to know what's going on in the world. I read The Economist. I will read The Spectator or something else like that. Not because it's necessarily something I'm naturally interested in, but I need to understand where the world is so I can go to the world. With my coaching, I like to say I lead with leadership principles and I surprise them by faith. So I don't lead by my faith. I get to my faith because I want to build a bridge. So I would just try and be really diverse in what you read. You won't be able to see here, but I've got a whole. So that's my John Maxwell shelf, all the books. That's my NT Wright. But I've got a whole shelf here just on economics. The one below here is entrepreneurialism, and that's not my natural passion. But I'm realizing where people are, where the people I'm going to meet and reach, those people, I need to speak their language. And so I would just encourage anyone in the church world just to get out of your bubble a little bit. It's amazing. The moment I stopped working for a church, the moment my vocab shifted from churchy words and churchy mindset to a focus on humans. So I wasn't just focusing on Christians, I was focusing on humans. And I've become a better communicator because I speak to humans, not Christians. Of course, Christians are humans, but I'd really challenge and encourage you to step out of your comfort zone and spend a week reading about the financial crisis in 2008 and the leadership that went on and why things went badly, the values that weren't propagated, the values that were propagated, and try and connect everything you read. It's this principle: this for what, or what for who. Like any content I have, I'm always thinking of the context. And I spent years, you saw those 20-odd thousand notes. I was obsessed with information, but I wrote this down. It's what John Maxwell told me last week. You need to compress what you learn and what you do. You need to compress the gap between everything you know and what you actually do, because we are obsessed with consumption, but actually implementing what we've consumed is very difficult. So we love new information, but the question is, how much of the information we know have we actually implemented into our lives? To me, it's all about initiation as opposed to intention. So we have great intentions, but I'm really accountable with my team. My team are based in America. It's killer with Zoom and time differences and COVID, but we're accountable with each other. We say, what are our 3 non-negotiable priorities for this week? We communicate them. And once we've done that, we know where we stand, and we've got to put, I think we've got to put some accountability structures in place, not just for our character, but for our content, what we're actually creating. And part of that is, it's a long answer to your question, but part of that is feeling okay to put yourself out there and not have this religious voice of I'm being narcissistic. Oh, it's all about me. For example, I hate my face being on anything, but I'm realizing people aren't going to spend time investing in content if they don't know the person behind the content. I remember speaking to Bishop TD Jakes, and he said the great thing, Rob, is you've got the content, you've got the production, you've interviewed over 100 people. That's the production. But the negative thing is distribution. No one knows you exist. So he says, spend the next 5 years not focusing on days, but decades. He said, focus on the fact that you need to be confident putting yourself out there, because you've got the production, you've got everything there, but you don't have the audience. And so I think that's another thing to focus on, reading outside your comfort zone, but at the same time, how are you going to distribute the product you have? There are really average books that get on New York Times bestsellers list because they've been marketed really well. And yet there are some of the greatest preachers in the world unknown because they won't put their content online. So I think there's a big barrier to a lot of people. They think they shouldn't put their content out there. But part of the self-discovery is letting go of the fact we'll be critiqued. People will have opinions, but it's better to be in the game than on the sidelines. It's a long answer, but I think there are a variety of elements that kind of lead to that. Okay, great. Well, I hope this has been a helpful session for you. I love speaking about communication. If there's any other questions you have, do go find me at Rob Wall Official on Instagram, Facebook, my website, www.robwallofficial.com. Just send a message. I'll answer any further questions that you have. But thank you so much for today, for giving me your time. I hope there are some practical tips and tools that you can use and utilize to connect for change. Remember, everybody communicates, but few people connect. And let's make sure and let's pray and hope that people hear what we say. Let's not assume they've heard, but let's put the work in, the prayer in, the preparation in, so that people can receive the message that we've got. God bless you, and I'll see you again soon. Thank you.